Bonjour, merci pour cette invitation, en particulier Iurie. Juste une petite question technique avant de commencer. J'imagine que pas tout le monde parle le français. Maybe an English version would be better. Désolé pour la francophonie, que je défendais en Moldavie il y a une dizaine d'années. Maintenant, je vais... Alors, mon intervention sera plutôt courte. Elle ne sera pas très originale dans la mesure où je vais faire un rappel d'une trentaine d'années, on va dire les 30 dernières années d'unipolarité, et qui, de toute évidence, justement, nous montre pourquoi est-ce qu'on doit maintenant défendre le monde multipolaire, et en particulier, un des piliers de ce monde multipolaire, à mon sens, c'est le respect du droit international. So, I will talk about the last 30 years of unipolarity in the world and in Europe, and it will be used as an example, a clear and obvious example about why we need to support a multipolar world based on international law. In 1997, Zbigniew Brzezinski exposed in his book, The Grand Chessboard, the strategic vision shaping US foreign policy. In order to establish its global hegemony, the USA must control Eurasia, especially its periphery, the Rimland, according to the geopolitician Nicholas Spikeman, and contain continental powers of the heartland, such as France, Germany, and Russia, or even more recently, in Eurasia, China, and India. After the dissolution of the USSR and the end of the Cold War's bipolar order, the USA tried to establish its control on a global scale, and as well to establish a unipolar system on a global scale, whose Western liberal values would bring peace, democracy, human rights, and prosperity to the peoples of the world. The 9/11 attacks contradicted these expectations, but the US government, under George Walker Bush, and the US neoconservative thinkers didn't reassess their vision of the world. Multilateralism, international law, and the United Nations were disregarded, and in 2003 the USA attacked Iraq, even though this country was not trying at that time to develop weapons of mass destruction or had no connection to the 9/11 attacks or to Al-Qaeda. Iraq was devastated by conflict with no end in sight, and the situation in the Middle East was seriously aggravated by such aggression. The Israeli-Palestinian peace process, as well as the issue of the Israeli-occupied Syrian Golan Heights, were gradually as well abandoned. And recently, Netanyahu expressed his will to annex the West Bank. The 2011 Arab Spring was an opportunity for the USA, their Gulf allies such as Qatar, Saudi Arabia, or the United Arab Emirates, and other countries such as Turkey and Israel, to destabilize countries such as Syria or Libya, whose regimes, inspired by Arab nationalism, represented obstacles to their regional agendas. The foreign policy led by the USA and its allies in the Middle East or in Afghanistan during the Cold War, and then during the Arab Spring, as well as their support to Islamist parties or armed groups, played a clear role in the regional and global development of terrorism. While Iran was looking in the last decade to establish new diplomatic and commercial relations with Europe and even the USA, Washington decided to go back to confrontation with Tehran. Unlike what US President Donald Trump declared during his trip in Saudi Arabia, Iran is not a sponsor of Islamist terrorism and is not a threat for European countries. Iran has been also a victim of Sunni Islamist terrorism, especially Daesh, and cooperates with many countries in the fight against terrorist groups. With regard to the crisis with Iran, the USA are not following their national interest, but rather the interest of Saudi Arabia and Israel, but are opposed to the rise of Iran as a regional power. In Europe, NATO and US expansion during the 90s and the 2000s revived and aggravated old conflicts in the Balkan or the Caucasus, such as the conflict in Georgia and South Ossetia in August 2008. The conflict affecting Donbass since 2014 is one of the symptoms of the European Union's political and geopolitical weakness, as well as its strategic dependence toward the USA through NATO. A bit less than 20 years after the war in former Yugoslavia and around 50 years after the conflict in Kosovo, the European Union failed to prevent the outbreak of a new conflict in Europe, in eastern Ukraine, and enabled the USA and NATO to strengthen their influence on Russia's borders. This policy, aiming at establishing a unipolar world system under US hegemony, led to several conflicts over the last 30 years and seriously undermined international law as well as the functioning and credibility of many international organizations such as the United Nations. Washington and NATO have also recreated a new Cold War in Europe by exploiting old national rivalries or ethno-linguistic issues such as in Ukraine, and using the memory of communist crimes, such as in Ukraine and Poland, to widen the gap between Russia and its neighbors. With the rebirth of China's power and its new Silk Road, the world axis, the axis mundi, has moved eastwards, towards Asia and the Pacific Ocean. Remaining in NATO and the absence of a privileged partnership with Russia could prevent EU countries to be strong enough to counterbalance China's power in Eurasia. While US neoconservative thinkers and European Atlantists continue to defend a unipolar world system put under a supposedly benevolent US leadership, the rise of the BRICS shows that the world system is now a multipolar one, and that it's time for some Western powers to respect the fundamental principles of international law that were undermined by the weaponization of human rights. Respecting international law, the state sovereignty and the Charter of the United Nations goes along with the vision of a multipolar world system, a system acknowledging the plurality and freedom of nations, in which every state really enjoys the same rights and remains master of its own fate. The United Nations provide an adequate forum, but some world powers, mainly Western powers, have subverted some of its principles and its functioning. In order to really and fairly reflect the evolution of the world towards a multipolar system, the UN Security Council must be reformed. But there is no consensus because of historical and political disputes between some countries, China and Japan, or India and Pakistan. Respecting the Chapter 7 of the UN Charter and implementing its Articles 46 and 47 on the establishment of the UN Military Staff Committee could be a good way as well to prevent NATO from violating international law and the UN Charter, or to exceed its mandate, as it happened during the conflicts in Kosovo and Libya. Merci beaucoup.